Salut, Luigi, eu sunt Luigi și alături de mine îl am pe Joe Tang, directorul de producție Metin2, și ne acordă un interviu audio. Hello, Joe, thanks for this opportunity.
Thanks for having me.
I'll start right away and go on with the first question. What recent updates to Metin2 have received the most positive feedback from the community?
I think it's really hard to point out one specific update because it's always a very kind of high volume of different feedback that we're getting. But I think in general, a lot of the quality of life improvements have met a lot of positive feedback from the community, which shows that players are really invested into us also improving existing systems and features in the game. Even though some of these changes might seem very small, you are not really familiar with Metin2. I'm of course aware that a lot of stuff could still be improved further, so we are also committed to continue pushing quality of life updates. But yeah, I would say in general, quality of life improvements have been received really positively.
How do you decide which features to prioritize in upcoming updates?
So for this question, obviously you need to understand that we as a publisher are not the only ones deciding on what will be the content of an update. Webzen as a developer also have their own ideas, their own strategy that they want to push. In this regard, both parties are on the same level, and we always need to negotiate and discuss what focus we want to put on. And usually we try to have a good mixture of that kind of fits the ideas of both partners. On our side, I can tell you that the focus is on the one side quality of life improvements, making the existing game easier, better, more enjoyable to play, while on the other hand, of course, also introducing new types of content so that also our kind of long-time players have something new to look forward to. And I would say Webzen in a certain way is the same, but of course within these kind of new content ideas or what kind of quality of life improvements to focus on, we might have different opinions, which is normal in such a arrangement. But yeah, it's usually a lot of kind of internal discussing, and then at some point we can agree on, okay, this is something that we want to push for the next year.
Are there any plans to make the game more accessible to new players?
Obviously, Metin2 is a 17-year-old game. I think already based on its age is a bit more difficult for new players to get a good start into the game, to learn how the game works. I think a lot of modern games do things very differently. So, of course, we still would like to introduce new players to the game. So certain aspects or certain improvements that we're doing are also things that could benefit new players. For example, the new NPC Finder feature that is now premiering on the Onyx servers should hopefully make it easier for players to understand where to find important NPCs, where they can find specific mobs or specific quests. So features that also introduce the players better to the world, introduce them better to the systems, because let's be honest here, sometimes starting into Metin2 can feel very daunting. It doesn't really explain a lot, as games didn't do that in the past. Nowadays, I think tutorial sections, etc. are more common. But of course, we also need to always be careful not to be updates, always things that we throw into the wrench and be okay, now see what you guys are doing with this. So that's definitely one of our main pillars in order to also keep the experience fresh for our existing players.
What is the development focus for Metin in the next 6 months?
I can't of course go into details for the rest of the year. We also want to introduce some more new content. That's very broad, I know, but also playable content is something that we still would like to stress. In a certain way, of course, the development for this year was already decided upon last year. Currently, the focus is more on defining what is going to be the focus for next year. And I think the focus points that I already mentioned are not necessarily going to change, even though I feel playable content is something that we want to push a bit more, as we feel even though we introduce a lot of systems on new events, etc., that actual playable content that also lasts, that is also permanent in the game, is something that we would like to have more in the game. Nothing has been defined yet, but this is definitely something that we would like to also see a bit more next year.
How do you gather and assess community feedback from various Metin2 forums?
We already have a lot of community managers in our different communities who, of course, are collecting the feedback from the community out of different channels. It's not just the forum, it's also on Discord, it's on social media, all kinds of different channels that we have. And could assume that a lot of players think, okay, we get the feedback and we don't do anything with it. But of course, once the feedback comes in, it usually takes time until, okay, we have the feedback. And then, for example, now we are talking about what we want to do for next year. A lot of the feedback, depending on what kind of play or request players have, might require like more development resource, etc., cannot be dealt with immediately. That's something that is unfortunately the case. Of course, for more minor things or things that are more on our side where we feel like, okay, this is something that we can change quicker, the feedback loop might be a bit shorter. But for example, a lot of the quality of life improvements are based on like huge lists of things that players are requesting. And of course, we need to filter them. We can't give webs a list of 200 items to like implement. We need to filter through them to a certain degree. We need to discuss it, we need to prioritize, and then certain things might come on the agenda. So things might always be very delayed for players. I know it's unfortunate, but that's just also the way things happen right now. But I can guarantee you feedback is always appreciated. We look at it. Of course, we cannot implement everything, but we will at least always evaluate.
What is your process for brainstorming new content ideas with the team?
Of course, on our side internally, we look at data, we look at player feedback, we look at, okay, what is the game missing? What are things that the game could really benefit from? And so we sit together, we collect ideas from, it's not just like product management, but also our game designers, like thinking about specific, can be events, features, or new kinds of like items, etc., that we think could be beneficial to the game. These things are then pitched to Webzen, and usually then there's like a lot of kind of like discussion going on, because Webzen of course also has their own ideas. So in the end, it's a lot of back and forth between what GameForge would like to push, what Webzen would like to push. And yeah, I would say it's a very free-flowing kind of process where we try to be very as creative as possible. And of course, in the midst of discussion, sometimes you're like, something that sounded like an amazing idea at first turns out to be, okay, probably not that great of an idea after all, or it's completely unrealistic on a technical level to implement. But yeah, we try to not limit ourselves, but of course, at some point you always need to be realistic and be like, okay, what is actually doable?
How do you decide when it's time to sunset certain features or content within the game?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. There's no all-encompassing answer to this. In general, though, of course, if we see in the data that content is not really where players don't really participate in, where we receive bad feedback, where we feel like players are not really engaging with the system, especially when it's about events, for example, that there might be a decision to not use specific events further rather quickly, because in the end, I think we have a lot of different events in Metin2, and running an event that is not really liked by players is just basically taking an event slot away from like other events that we could run instead, that more players enjoy, where we also see more engagement from players. Yeah, I would say depending on the content, it can be quicker, where we are more stricter, where we're like, okay, if things don't work out really quickly, then even after we made adjustments, this might just not be the best thing to continue running. Of course, for other content that's like permanent in the game, we usually try not to deliberately take out content out of the game if it's not really necessary, if it doesn't hurt anyone. But of course, if there are certain disadvantages of keeping it in the game, then the decision might be quick of like, okay, just to save ourselves some troubles, this might be sunset. But yeah, it's a very difficult question to answer broadly.
How do you handle feedback when new updates are not well received by players?
I feel like we handle feedback the same way, regardless whether it's positive or negative. Obviously, if it's negative, the first question is to check, okay, why? What was perceived negatively? Because on our side, we never intend to release bad content, obviously. So it's usually very interesting for us to see, okay, what did players perceive maybe differently than from how we expected them to perceive it. This doesn't necessarily mean that we know things better than our players. I think the players actually know the game better than we do. And so for us, the first thing we need to do is evaluate, okay, what is it that is a problem? What is being negatively received? What can we do about this? Is this something that we can change on our side? Is this something that requires bigger changes? Like the Somali invasion system was something that required a more, like I wouldn't even say that the feedback was terrible, but it was definitely not as good as we would have liked it to be. And changing it more on a fundamental level required a bit more thinking, a bit more discussions in order to make it happen. But it also required us to understand what parts of the event are actually being criticized, being negatively perceived. So yeah, it's a lot of investigation and also trying to pull the right answers out of it. Okay, what can we do to try to accommodate this feedback? Which is not always easy, because sometimes you realize that this is the problem, but you don't really know, okay, what is a good way to solve it without breaking the event. Because sometimes obvious solutions feel very obvious, but then you're like, okay, but then the event doesn't make sense anymore, for example. So yeah, it's a challenging process.
Has the invasion become more popular after the update?
I feel like we are seeing a positive effect for sure. Of course, also for these kind of revamps, then we get new feedback of like, okay, this could have been different. So this is a kind of like never-ending process. But looking at like very early data, we are quite happy with what we're seeing.
How do you balance the creation of new content with the need for frequent bug fixes or system improvements?
Yeah, that's obviously always a challenge in such a big MMO like Metin2. Bugs and like problems are always present. And of course, also on the developer side, like we need to always prioritize, okay, which bugs are very important to be fixed because they negatively impact the player experience, while still like keeping resources available to develop new content. It's always a very hard balancing act. I can't really tell you like how we do it. In the end, like it's a lot of prioritization and also ad hoc decision making of what is actually really important right now. Obviously, bugs are usually more like acutely happening when we release a new patch, for example. So it's a bit less planned because our content updates are planned very well in advance. So we usually have buffers for when we need to roll out things, when we need to have developer attention on potential bugs or things that we need to fix. So yeah, there's a lot of scheduling and planning behind this to make sure that we have enough time for both. But I, of course, need to admit that there is just not enough time to fix all the bugs. There will always be things that might not be optimal in the game. That's just the reality of it.
Time is our biggest enemy.
Indeed.
How do you ensure that monetization doesn't negatively impact gameplay?
Obviously, monetization is always a difficult topic with free-to-play games. We, of course, try to strike a good balance between free-to-play elements and also offering things in the item shop for players who are willing to invest money into the game, also for us to make up our costs and make sure that we can keep providing the service that we are providing to players to keep the servers running. So especially for like new content, there's always like a huge discussion internally as well of whether specific features, events need to have monetized aspects to it, for example. And there might be times when we decide against it. There might be times when we decide for it. Of course, these kind of things are not really visible to players. If you don't do something, they might not know that something could have been done there. But yeah, it's a very difficult balance to strike. And I also understand that this is a very controversial topic where probably a lot of people will have very different opinions. But it's a topic where we try to strike as much of a balance as possible.
What is the biggest technical challenge that Metin2 currently faces?
To say it in a nutshell that it's 17-year-old, I think a lot of the quality of life improvements, for example, that we would like to push further. Sometimes there are technical hurdles to it that it's difficult to imagine sometimes. But if you think about how old the game is, that like technical foundation on which it's built is for today's standards very outdated. It becomes very difficult to implement certain improvements that we would, or that a lot of players that play modern games might take for granted. It's very hard to pinpoint like specific aspects of that. But in general, the game is definitely on the technical side showing its age, and on our side, the challenge is usually to, instead of changing everything about because it's really hard. It's more like how can we like circumvent things? How can we trick the system to a way where we can make it do things that it wasn't built for? So that's definitely one of the biggest challenges.
So the next question is about the quality of life improvements. Although it was very well received by the community, there is still room for improvement. Are you taking into consideration tackling this more?
Yes, we do not want to stop like trying to improve the existing game, existing features. I'm not sure like what kind of systems you are like focusing on. Inventory,
Tradable item.
Yeah, I think we already made some progress on this topic. It's always been a lot of work to try to push as many items to make like add these kind of tradability, storability and all that stuff. Inventory space is something that we would like to push, but is also a difficult topic because the implementation, I know it sounds very easy, I know. It's just make more inventory space. I understand, but there are definitely limitations there where we need to think about how we do this without endangering the stability of the game. Because in the end effect, like we always also need to take into consideration, we don't want game performance to suffer by people having like more inventory space. Like it's a very difficult balance to strike and we are currently thinking about different things where we could alleviate the inventory problem a bit further, but there's nothing that I can go into details right now, but I'm aware there is still things that we could improve. It's just sometimes, unfortunately, more difficult than it initially sounds. So yeah, we will need to see. But I can assure you this is definitely a topic that keeps being on the table when we're discussing things with Webzen.
How do you decide which events to run in Metin?
So obviously some events are very much tied to specific holidays or events, be it summer events or Easter, Ramadan is something where the only thing we are deciding is when they are about to start. And for Easter and Ramadan, it's always a bit of a struggle because those two events are usually very close to one another, and depending on the year, they are either very overlapping a lot or not overlapping at all. So this is usually a challenge, but other than that, of course, we have a lot of events that are usually very popular with the community, and we try not to prefer one event over the other. We try to have a good intervals of, okay, I feel like we haven't run this event in a long time, maybe we should run this now. Certain events we also try to run at least once a year. Some other events are designed in a way that we can run it more often, more frequently. Otherworld, for example, is one of those events. But yeah, there are always a lot of kind of like considerations behind this. Yeah, not sure whether anything more I can say about this.
What about the Nazar amulet in the auction house? Is that predetermined when it appears or not?
So is it in combination with the events?
Not necessarily.
I mean, of course, for Nazar specifically, sometimes when it's also like part of the event set, we try to coincide certain items when it also fits to the event itself. But for kind of very popular items, they might also be put in outside of events, also because we know that there is a demand from players for those items. But that's usually then like more a sales and monetization decision than like it's necessarily being tied to a specific event.
Thank you. Down to the 3 last questions. Mm-hmm. Can you share any future plans or discuss whether players can influence future event design?
There's no specific event that I can tease right now for the future, but in general, and I think I said this before when we were talking about community feedback as well, every piece of feedback, be it for events or server starts or other features or systems, are helpful for us to determine whether we can improve certain things or also for ideas for new events that might be missing. Like sometimes players suggest, for example, adjustments to events that are so drastic where we feel like, hey, we can actually make it a completely different event out of this. So I would say always be vocal, use the channels that are available, and maybe some of your ideas or feedback might be part of some kind of improvements on some kind of new event in the future.
And most important, be polite while doing this.
Obviously, like I can always say, I understand sometimes when players feel angry or are disappointed. These are normal emotions that everyone feels. And in this regard, I don't think any one of us is here the company being like offended by people showing their emotions. I think the only thing that I would usually also say is please always be aware that there are also humans on the other side, humans that are doing their jobs. Sometimes it's also out of their control. So yeah, please try to be nice to our people in customer support, community management, because they are doing a great job and a very important job.
Very nice. Has the player behavior changed in the pandemic? And if so, how are you adapting to it?
So I wouldn't say that player behavior necessarily has changed. Obviously, the pandemic was also for us a very, I'm missing the word, it brought a lot of changes with it in terms of how we work and how also the game performed. I think one of the big surprises for us is that, of course, during the pandemic, and I think that was a thing throughout the whole industry, that a lot of people who might not have played games for a long time found their way back into video games because they were sitting at home, didn't have a lot of other stuff to do, so why not take out one of the old video games that people played in the past? And of course, when the pandemic ended, we could see activity went down a bit again. But ever since, I would say, the release of Ruby, the Metin2 community has grown again. We are now, I can't really say numbers, but we are now on a level where we don't feel like we have to say, oh, during COVID was much better. We are definitely seeing growing numbers, which is amazing for a game that is already 17 years old. And I think it's a testament for all the passion that the community still has for the game. I actually really believe that a lot of players that rediscovered the game during the pandemic are also still playing. Basically, they found their way back in, and they might have taken breaks in between again, but have latched also onto some of the releases that we had. The Ruby and Emerald were really successful for us in this regard. So I wouldn't say that necessarily player behavior has changed. There are just certain things where you could argue, okay, maybe players can also, that there are more people that are also working from home now, that are able to maybe even keep their PCs running while they are working at home. But these are things that is more on the speculation side, where I don't have like actually concrete data where I could tell you, okay, this has definitely changed. So yeah.
And we are down to our last question. Where do you see Metin2 in the next 5 years?
It's a very interesting question. Of course, I don't have my crystal ball with me, but I definitely see Metin2 still very alive and kicking next 5 years. I think, as I said in the previous question, the game or the community is really showing that there's a lot of passion behind this game. I think Metin2 provides a game experience that no other MMO does, and that's why it can still thrive in this very challenging MMO environment that we're having. And I honestly do not see any reason why this should change. I think we have a lot of great stuff upcoming, even though I sometimes have people from the industry asking me, wait, what do you mean? Metin2 is still alive? It's still live? Really? And my answer is always yes, and it's running well, it's performing well, we have a lot of players, and I don't see that changing in the next 5 years. Yeah, I think my wish, of course, would be to grow Metin2 even further within the next few years, but I think the general gist of it is, I think Metin2 still has a really bright future ahead of it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this opportunity, for this interview, and for these cool insights in the world of Metin and in the life of a Metin2 product manager.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. I had a lot of fun. Also, always happy to support you guys. I know you guys are also doing great job creating content for the game, being a voice for the community, etc. So I really appreciate you also taking the time to visit us here at Gameforge. I hope you're having a great time here. And yeah, as I said, had a lot of fun here in this interview, and happy to be on it again maybe in the future if time permits it.
Gladly. Thank you very much.
Thank you as well. And yeah, see ya again next time.
See you.